So like it was introduced, my name is Michał Stradowski. I'm working in Wipro Digital as engineering studio lead. And today I would like to talk about A/B testing approach that we did on our company's website using AWS CloudFront and Lambda at Edge. So let's imagine a scenario where we have a website, single page application or static website served through CDN, and we want to basically create experimentation between two different versions of this application. A/B testing doesn't necessarily mean that we have two equal versions and we have 50-50 split of entire traffic. For us, it was more important to be able to do experiment on real users, on real customers, just on a fraction of that, and actually on the entire website. We didn't want to do experiment with just change of part of the content or one button, label, or logo. This type of testing or experimentation would be better for marketing purposes, targeted campaigns, things like that. Here, we would like to focus on testing two complete versions of the website or single-page application. Basically, for A/B testing, you can say there are two main approaches. First would be the server side, and the second would be the client side, based on the fact where you're putting the logic that is deciding which versions to serve to the client. Now, for us, obviously, we didn't want to do it on the client side because we have static website. We serve it through S3 buckets with completely no brains. Therefore, we had to put it on the server side. And due to the fact that we're using CDN as our CDN CloudFront, that's where we had to put the logic for the A/B testing. Now, Lambda at Edge is recently announced, at least for me. It was in June 2017, I think, publicly available from AWS. So it's still fresh and quite new feature. It allows us to run Lambda functions at edge locations of our CDN. It means you may actually add logic into the CDN and intelligence without having to forward the request to the backend and losing caching and ability to have geographical proximity to your users. So the big benefits of using CDN. Like I said, working on our website, we wanted to actually be able to do this A/B testing. Therefore, Lambda at Edge was our option. So let's maybe go through the solution. How did it work actually for us? So this is the, one second. Yeah, so this is the rough design of the solution that we implemented, and I will now try to walk you through it. What's very important with A/B testing is that you will not have a situation when your user will be jumping between two different versions throughout the session. So, for example, whenever he clicks, he's getting version A or B, randomly. Or even worse, when he's getting actual content on one page, portion from version I, portion from version B. To avoid that, we did implement a cookie. We call it X-source in this example. And while walking through those steps, I will try to explain what happens with that cookie. And that's kind of important to sustain one version for the customer throughout the journey or for the user throughout the journey. So in step one, everything starts in the browser, obviously. The browser request is directed to the cloud, to the closest AWS Edge location. The request may or may not contain the X-source cookie, hence the brackets. The steps 2 means that the first Lambda at Edge function is getting triggered. We called it viewer request. This Lambda function would be, in this example, triggered on every request, on every call. And if the cookie exists, it basically does nothing. If it doesn't exist, then it will roll the dice and decide which version to serve to the customer, and accordingly set the cookie to the header. Now, the next step is the distribution area. Distribution decides whether the request is cache hit or miss. If it is cache hit, it will just provide the content straight from the distribution, so the bottom part, blue or green. If it is cache miss, it will push it to the origin. And then it will be intercepted by the step 4, which is another Lambda function. It's our function that we called origin request. Yes, very original, I know. This function basically again, checks if cookie exists. But the main reason for that function is by default to fold it to the original request, to the main request, to the main S3 bucket, and provide the content that is main content. However, if the X source cookie exists and it actually has a value of experiment for that example, it will rewrite the origin entirely. And I will show it in the code example, in the code snippet, how it's being done. One thing I didn't notice in step 3, or actually in the distribution configuration, is that we have to make sure that we set up X source as a whitelisted element parameter passed through the distribution so that we don't lose it, but we'll talk about it in a second as well. Step 5 is very simple. So S3 buckets are just basically serving the content, completely ignoring cookie, completely ignoring the logic. On step 6, we have our third Lambda function, and this Lambda function is called origin response. And the reason for origin response is quite important. This function is quite important, and the reason for it is it has to set a cookie again. Now, I know I mentioned in the viewer request we are setting a cookie. In the origin request, we are passing that cookie and checking if it exists, so why would we have to again set it up in the origin response? Well, simply because not every request from browser would have this cookie. So if it doesn't have if it isn't set by browser, it will not return by browser as well in some scenarios, and we'll get a problem of customers getting sometimes different versions or different views of the journey. So here we also have to set up the right cookie again and pass the response from the origin, either main or experimental, straight through the CDN. Now, in step 7, the only important thing that happens is there is caching happening, right? So the distribution will cache the content if it is not yet cached, and it wouldn't be because we're going all the way through origin request and response. And it caches it with the set cookie parameter, which we set up in the step 6, which is very important because in the step 8, it just drives it to the browser from the nearest edge location, but step 9, browser will actually comply with the set cookie. And from there, we will have one unique or standard version for the customer for the duration of the session. So from that point, every time customer comes in or user comes into our page, he or she will get the same version until the cookie expired. In case of cache hit, so on the step 3, in case of cache hit, we would be actually already directed to step 10 and omit 4, 5, 6, and 7, and serve the content with set cookie parameter header, just because we cached it. Now, let's talk a bit about the benefit of that example. Now, obviously, this is just one of the examples that we can that we can implement it this way. There could be less or more Lambda functions, but we choose this way for those particular example benefits. Now, the solution allows leveraging CDN caching, obviously keeping both versions of content in the cache. The additional overhead of the viewer request and viewer response is quite negligible because we are using single function for all content, for all the content, so it is mostly hot. We don't have the cold start latency problem neither on Node.js Lambdas or on Lambda at edge, which anyway is quite fast. What we measured is that the function execution is well under 1 millisecond for most of the times, which for us it's quite good and enough, especially for single page application. Couple of requests, fraction of requests were around 15, 20 milliseconds. It's still okay. I don't think there is a problem. That's why we mentioned it's negligible. The big plus of that implementation is we don't need to make any changes to the application, either front end or back end, if you want to. The only thing we need to focus in on is on the actual viewer request Lambda. So if we want to turn on or off the A/B testing approach, the only thing we need to do is just attach or detach viewer request. From there, the switching is almost autonomous for the customer or the user, and it's propagated across all the edge locations. Now, let's quickly go through the settings. What's important in the settings is that you have two S3 buckets in separate origins, so they both have to have restricted by origin access identity set. That's pretty obvious. What's not that obvious, or what wasn't that obvious to us, is that, first of all, we need to make sure that we are passing as whitelist the cookie, so we're forwarding cookie as whitelist, as it is shown on the right-hand side, and whitelist cookie is X source, like I mentioned. And we did set up one behavior, which is default, because by default we want to go with origin, so the logic is only executed when we want to do actual experiment. This simplifies the implementation a lot for us and makes it quite robust. Now, the next step would be the viewer request. I will quickly skim through the code. If anybody wants to talk more about the details, come over to the Wipro desk and I can answer any of questions. But this function is very simple. It's the only Lambda function that's executed every single time, before the CDN decides whether it's cache hit or miss. And the function just looks for the X source code, cookie code, as I mentioned, and sets up the cookie accordingly if it doesn't exist. Now, the next one, origin request, is a bit more interesting in my opinion, because it does one very important thing. It sets up the origin accordingly, so there is line 20 request origin. It just overrides the existing origin if it's not the default, so the main one. What's also important with that function is the host header must be changed accordingly, or the execution would fail. Now, that was also quite a quick finding that we noticed while implementing that. The origin response, very simple and straightforward code as well. The origin response is only triggered on cache misses, so only when we don't have CDN caching implemented, so first user, first location request. The event passed to the function contains both the request and the decorated by viewer request information, so it has this header from the viewer request. However, like I mentioned, if this was a first call and the customer didn't have the cookie, if we wouldn't set it up here again, the customer would again would go through the journey of roll the dice and may end up on either mine or experimental version. So it's very important in this function to again set the cookie and pass it. Like I said, we add set cookie to be sure the browser will set the same thing after every cache hit. So now, with every implementation like that, with every quite fresh and new functionality, we're getting those gotcha moments. We're getting those moments where we, figure out that something works slightly differently than we anticipated or expected. We had a couple of those during our implementation. One, for those who actually looked at the code, they would probably notice that all parameters were hardwired. For example, when I actually overwrite the origin, I did hardwire all the information. It's not bad Node.js coding, it's just because Lambda at edge doesn't allow the dynamic parameters to be passed, which is kind of obvious and not obvious, at least to us. Now, a couple of other important gotcha moments were that Lambda functions, if they will be connected to CloudFront distribution, they need to be actually set up in the Virginia region, so US East 1. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to connect them to CloudFront. It's similar limitation like with anything that you connect to CloudFront. SSL certificates works the same on AWS as well. Like I mentioned, because you cannot actually do any dynamic parameters, you have to hardwire them in the code. The reason for it is Lambda at edge should be serverless. Lambda should be serverless, so it is. What's very interesting, and it actually is combination of both of those gotchas, is the third one, execution logs. Now, obviously, when we do application, we do need to look at logs sometimes, especially when we do experiments and want to check how they went. Execution logs roam across CloudWatch regions for Lambda at edge. First of all, logs for entire Lambdas goes to CloudWatch normally, you would think, but they don't end up in the region when they were created. So the Virginia region, they would end up in the region when they were actually executed. So even though I created it in Virginia, I'm connecting from Warsaw to Amsterdam, for example, the logs would be there. If for some reason I'm connected to London, EU central one, east one, east two, or whichever, the logs will be there for those particular executions. So you have to be mindful that sometimes, for some reason, even though you're connecting from Warsaw, you may not always end up in Amsterdam. Now, that's kind of okay and cool if you know about it, but then we go into the log groups, and we sometimes do create those, and the log groups don't end up in the distribution, in the CloudWatch of the location it was executed. They actually end up always in the region of the creation. So if you're creating those log groups, they will be always in Virginia region, except again, if you are debugging, for example, so running an AWS console and you would like to check your debug logs, they would not end up in the Virginia location. They would end up in kind of default location, which is AWS/lambda/function name. So those were 3 key gotchas that we got that actually made us realize that even though there is a lot of documentation out there, even AWS guideline and CDN know-hows do explain how to use Lambda ADH for A/B testing, and they don't go to depths of actually those gotchas, and we had to figure them out on ourselves. Now, a couple of other gotchas, I will probably skip through them because I'm already well past my time, but come over to Wipro desk and we can talk about it in more details. Conclusion, like I said, it's very exciting to use new technologies. You have to always remember that if something is not well defined or well documented, you will get those moments when you actually end up trying to figure out why does it not work or why does it work like this. In Build It and Wipro Digital, we try to actually find this type of use cases, figure them out, and put them out there so that people can read. We have a huge blog that actually talks about a lot of implementations similar like that are just experiments for us. So regardless of all of that and all the limitation, implementing A/B testing is actually not that complex, and it was quite fun. So thank you for listening, and hope we can talk about it later. Thank you, guys.
Michał Stradowski.